Hey guys, welcome back. This is a story of what if Naruto was a seal master. A seal had managed to defeat and imprison the Kyuubi no Kitsune, the strongest demon to ever exist. It was just ink on paper or a stomach as the case may be, and it held so much power. Naruto decided, gotta get me some of that. Before we start, don't forget to like and subscribe and check the description for the creator of this great fanfic. Thank you. Now let's start the story. Chapter 6. Back in Konoha, Kakashi found he didn't have much of a report left to give, since most of it had already been sent to the Hokage through Naruto's messenger tube. So it didn't take him long to pass along the few remaining details once they'd returned to Konoha. Thank you, the old Hokage said, nodding as Kakashi finished. You did exceptional work. Although, I must ask, the great Naruto bridge. Well, you see, Kakashi said as he rubbed the back of his head sheepishly, trying to think of a way to explain just how the bridge had come to be named after Naruto when he himself wasn't too clear on anything other than the villagers getting wind of Naruto's massive use of Kage Bunshin on the bridge during their last week there, and Sasuke and Sakura wanting to make amends with Naruto. And thinking that it was hilarious that another monument would be named after him. The Hokage just raised an eyebrow at him. You had to have been there, I guess, he finally said. This is becoming quite a habit, the Hokage said mildly. It isn't often a genin has a single major monument named in their honor, much less two. Kakashi laughed nervously. Nevertheless, I'll note a commendation in all of your files for your team's work. It's extraordinary such a rookie genin team could accomplish so much, he said. Now we need to discuss one of your students. Yes, Kakashi agreed. I need to know everything you do about Naruto. Kakashi noted the small signs of the Hokage's surprise, and wondered who he'd thought they were going to talk about. Yes, Naruto, the Hokage said, steepling his hands in front of him. Unfortunately, the fact is that I do not know much. But how can that be? Kakashi asked, taken aback by the answer. The third sighed and turned to look out the window. When Naruto was a very young child, just a toddler, in fact, he was removed from the orphanage, the Hokage told him. I was not informed until at least a week had passed, and I have still been unable to determine exactly who removed him and how. He must have seen the skepticism Kakashi felt. That doesn't mean there weren't consequences. Not knowing precisely who was involved didn't stop me from demonstrating my displeasure to everyone who might have been involved, through either action or inaction. And believe me, I was very displeased. Kakashi's nodded. The third may have appeared to be grandfatherly, but then, he was one of the best shinobi to ever live and had no issue with exploiting people's perceptions of him. That someone might have been good enough to pull one over on the third was difficult to comprehend, but it made slightly more sense to Kakashi that Naruto had somehow wound up in the Akasen when he knew that the Hokage hadn't been able to locate him. It had been incomprehensible to Kakashi that Naruto would grow up as he had if the Hokage truly had been watching over his shoulder, as Kakashi had always imagined. I didn't see him again until he showed up here one day quite at random to gain the necessary permission to apply for the Academy's preparatory school, the third explained. I approved it, of course, and the boy was gone again before I could make too many inquiries of him. Since then, on the few occasions I've had to see the boy, whenever I broach the topic Naruto manages to change the subject and then seems to disappear completely, from both my office and Konoha as a whole. Kakashi tried to take in what the third was telling him. He'd seen Naruto's disappearing act personally, so part of the tale he knew could be true. And he could imagine Naruto keeping secrets from the Hokage without too much difficulty. He was remarkably cagey and tight-lipped when he wanted to be. But the rest of it, he found it difficult to believe that the Hokage would allow the container of the nine-tailed fox to go missing for any length of time. The academy started at 8, and the prep school was a year before that, so if the Hokage were telling him the truth, Naruto would have been missing for 4 or 5 years. Konoha just wasn't big enough for Kakashi to swallow that easily. There was more to this story. The Hokage just didn't want to share. I tell you all of this in the strictest confidence, you understand, the Hokage said. Of course, Kakashi agreed. Especially since the Hokage had told him much less that might be of any use than Naruto himself had shared. There was one more thing. He wants to tell his teammates. The Hokage blinked in surprise. About his burden, the Hokage clarified. When Kakashi nodded, the Hokage put his hand on his chin, stroking his beard and thought. They're good kids, Kakashi said. They won't do anything potentially dangerous with the knowledge. I would impress upon them the importance of that. He didn't bother with the arguments about it being Naruto's right to tell his friends, or that he deserved the opportunity to share it with the people he cared about. Such arguments, he knew, wouldn't sway the Hokage on a matter of village security. This requires thought. I will consider the matter. Until then, it remains an S-class secret. Do you understand? And Kakashi knew he meant, do you understand? You must tell Naruto no until I say otherwise. Hi, Hokage-sama, Kakashi demurred. Good, the Hokage said. Then for now, I'll only say this. I am old, Kakashi, and had I a successor, I would certainly allow this decision to be his, as the repercussions would mostly fall onto his shoulders. Kakashi slouched a bit, displeased by the implication. It wasn't even close to the first time the Hokage had brought up with him the idea of becoming his successor. If it had been, he doubted Danzo would ever have cared enough about him to start those rumors. But it was the first time he'd added a carrot and a stick to the offer. Because at the same time he was implying he would allow Kakashi to make the call once he accepted the position, he was also hinting that he could hold out from making any decision at all until Kakashi accepted. Kakashi was reasonably certain he had no desire at all to become Hokage, so that could be a rather long wait. I see, was all Kakashi said. As upset as he was over the Hokage's initial evasion of his questions combined with the anger that the Hokage was willing to use his kids to manipulate him, he had a very great deal more he could have said already perched on the tip of his tongue, but he forced it to stay there. The Hokage was remarkably tolerant when compared to the cages of the other great nations, but some of the things Kakashi wanted to say would likely push even Sarutobi's renowned patience. The Hokage nodded, then changed the topic. Then let us continue. Naruto wasn't the student I wanted to discuss. Oh. Then who was? Kakashi asked curiously, putting everything else out of his mind for the moment. It wasn't doing him any good there at the moment, anyway. Haruno Sakura, the Hokage said. I'm afraid I have some unfortunate news. That's a horrible thing to say, she whispered. You're lying. Sakura, Kakashi said. I wish I were. No, it can't be true, she said, voice beginning to rise with panic. My parents aren't dead. They're not. A patrol found them on their way back from Ipana. Their entire caravan died along with the team hired to guard them. Kakashi thought it better to give her all of the facts at once than to piecemeal the information and create a new blow with each new fact. The tears began streaming down Sakura's face as the shock began to wear a bit off and reality began to set in. She collapsed forward, and Kakashi caught her and held her in his lap, offering what small comfort he could. I'm so sorry, Sakura, Kakashi murmured as he stroked her back, letting her cry herself out against him. It was a few minutes later when Naruto and Sasuke came back from where he'd sent them off so he could tell her the news in privacy. Their eyes immediately snapped to Kakashi, silently asking what had happened. He tilted his head to the file lying on the table, and the boys quickly skimmed through it. He knew the moment they saw it, their bodies tensed and they looked first to each other, then to him and Sakura. The boys immediately rushed over, and Kakashi found himself with three 12-year-olds practically sitting in his lap. They're gone, Sakura managed through her tears. Mama and Papa. They're gone. Naruto rubbed her back and squeezed Sasuke and Kakashi, obviously unsure of what else to do. Kakashi silently wished him luck in figuring it out, because he himself had no clue. We'll take care of you, Sakura-chan, Sasuke murmured softly. We've got you. You're not alone. Remember that. No matter what, you're not alone. When Sakura finally fell asleep, Kakashi and the boys continued to sit there for a few minutes before Naruto disentangled himself. Kakashi was more than a little surprised when Sasuke made no move to do the same. The boy was pricklier than a thorn bush at times, and physical touch was always a difficult issue for him. But for the moment anyway, he seemed content to stay tucked against Kakashi's side, curled into Sakura and Kakashi both. Naruto picked up the file he and Sasuke had skimmed earlier, and Kakashi knew he was committing it to memory. The report says they were just regular bandits. Naruto didn't look up from the file as he took care to speak softly enough to not wake Sakura. Even a weak genin team would have been able to fight off bandits. Or at least their Junin sensei should have. So why didn't they hire one? They've done this route for years, they knew the dangers. They did, Kakashi said. Naruto raised an eyebrow and turned to the end of the report where the mission was listed. There's no way this could have been bandits, right? Naruto asked. Kakashi nodded his agreement, but didn't have any answers. I want to see this ambush site, Naruto said. Sakura-chan can't stay alone tonight, Sasuke said. Naruto shook his head in agreement. Don't think you're going alone, Sasuke warned. Don't think either of you are going anywhere tonight, Kakashi countered. He had a violent need to get all of his kids back somewhere safe and keep a very close watch over them. I want all of you to bunk with me tonight, Kakashi said, nudging Sasuke to move so he could get up. Then he stood, carrying the sleeping Sakura against his chest, and motioned the boys to take the file and Sakura's equipment and began heading towards his apartment. Well, the real us will, Naruto said as though that were obvious. Of course we're staying with Sakura-chan. But that doesn't mean we can't still check out the ambush site. Kakashi raised an eyebrow, silently asking how Naruto planned to stay with Sakura and go scout the location her parents had died at the same time. Onigiri Bunshin? Sasuke asked. Naruto nodded. You'll come, too, right Kaka-sensei? Naruto asked, tugging at his Junin vest as he looked up at him with a hint of uncertainty playing across his face. Kakashi rapidly analyzed the pros and cons of going with them versus ordering them to stay. They should stay. They weren't authorized to leave the village for this. They were all tired, and they were unlikely to find anything the Anbu hadn't noted in their report. And Sakura needed them. But, Naruto was absolutely right about the inconsistency of saying simple bandits had been able to take down a Junin and his genin team. And Kakashi really did want to see the ambush site. And, if he ordered them to stay, he wasn't certain he wanted to test whether they would or not. I'll go, Kakashi confirmed. Naruto nodded and pulled out 2 sets of seals. From where, Kakashi wasn't certain, but he'd stopped being surprised when Naruto popped seals out of what seemed like thin air. Sasuke hiked up his shirt and turned, letting Naruto place one of the seals on the small of his back then swipe it with a sliced, bloody finger. Moments later, another Sasuke was in the room. Your turn, sensei, Naruto offered. I can make my own cage bunshin, he reminded the boys. Yeah, but, well, Naruto stammered, scratching his head. They aren't as good, you know. What if you get hit with something? Kakashi raised an eyebrow. He wasn't some green genin after all. Please, sensei, Naruto asked. And Kakashi noted that even Sasuke seemed to be watching him intently. He shrugged, supposing there was no harm in it, and nodded. Naruto repeated the process, and Kakashi shuddered at the strange sensation of a foreign non-medical chakra coursing through him, especially one that was so volatile. That feels really strange, Kakashi said even as another copy of him showed up. Naruto looked away, then shrugged and tossed a seal out which shortly became a Naruto clone. That wasn't a criticism, Naruto, Kakashi said, wishing he had a free hand to do something to reassure Naruto, who had remained sensitive to any perceived disapproval and had been noticeably emotionally vulnerable even after their talk. Meltdown. Group therapy session. After their leaving wave. He was glad when his clone apparently had the same thought and smoothed Naruto's hair down. Or tried to, anyway. You've come up with an amazing technique. But having foreign chakra invade my system is still unsettling, no matter how useful the jutsu, Kakashi said, suddenly so exhausted he could barely stand. He had 3 remarkable students who he had no doubt would one day be legends. But he also knew that his 3 remarkable students were also remarkably traumatized, each in their own way. And that they'd grow into legends only if he could get them through their adolescence. No small feat, even for a Junin with normal children. Naruto, Sasuke, and Sakura were far from normal children. You 3 should head out, he told the clones. Come on, the Kakashi copy said, and the Naruto clone and Sasuke clone both followed him as he melted into the shadows to sneak out of the village. Kakashi wondered whether he should have more qualms than he did about showing 2 genin how to leave the village undetected, then decided that they likely would have found a way to manage it on their own anyway. The village's defenses were geared a great deal more towards keeping people out than in, after all. And, if Kakashi showed them the way, he would at least know where to start looking if they ever tried to use it on their own one day. Then Sasuke's hand reached out and brushed the hair away from Sakura's face where it had covered her eyes as Kakashi had carried her. And he knew that, no matter what happened, so long as these kids had each other they'd turn out just fine. He knew they were only clones, but Kakashi couldn't help but be proud of his boys and their ability to move. He'd been traveling quickly, and they hadn't had any trouble keeping up. No matter how they complained, those laps around the lake had definitely been good for them. He wondered whether they'd be faster if it had been the real Sasuke and Naruto instead of their clones. That they'd also been able to follow him out of the village without alerting any of the village's security, while equally impressive, was expected of them at this point. If it hadn't been, he never would have agreed to the outing in the first place. He flicked his hand out, using the sign language he'd been drilling into them to let the boys know their target wasn't far away. They were there a few moments later and Kakashi frowned as he took in the remnants of the sight. There were clear signs of shinobi involvement, slashes in trees from kunai, a burned spot on the ground from too much chakra in too concentrated a spot, markings in the bark on branches where shinobi sandals had tread. Sensei. Sasuke said, pointing towards a shuriken stuck in a branch. This couldn't have been bandits, right? Naruto asked, eyeing it. Couldn't have been. I wouldn't say that, Kakashi answered. There's always a possibility things aren't as they seem. But in this case, I would say that possibility is very, very small. That the Haruno's trading caravan had been attacked so deep within Fire's border was bad. That the genin team they'd hired as escorts hadn't been able to defend them was worse. That somehow the Anbu who'd found the site and made the report had either missed the signs that it had been shinobi who'd attacked, or had deliberately left that information out of the report was catastrophic. You aren't to speak of this outside of my presence, do you understand? Kakashi ordered. They clearly didn't, but nodded anyway. And he knew that in this, they would do as he said. Good. Now dispel yourselves. He waited until they had, making sure they were truly gone before continuing the investigation on his own. The next morning, a pounding on the door woke them all up. Kakashi was disoriented for a moment as he took in the fact that, while he was definitely in his own bed, he had 3 warm lumps in bed with him. Then, as the pounding resumed, he remembered. Who the fuck is it? Naruto mumbled. Kakashi sighed, scooting Sakura carefully off of him and onto a pillow even as Sasuke and Naruto shifted out of his way. Kakashi, get your ass out here, came the voice from the other side of the door. Asuma, Kakashi recognized as he made his way to the door, running a hand over his face to make sure his mask was still in place. What is it? Kakashi asked as he opened the door. Asuma paused at seeing the other Junin in such disarray, no forehead protector, no Junin vest, no sandals, rumpled clothes, and hair every which way. Not that the last was that unusual. What are you doing still asleep? Asuma demanded. Haven't you heard about your student? Which one? Kakashi asked with a sigh. Because with his kids, it could be any of them. Which one? Asuma asked incredulously. Sakura, of course. Ino has been demanding that I find her so she and her mother can look after her for a while since she doesn't have anyone else to do it. Kakashi felt the sudden presence of his boys, one at each side. He looked down to find them both glaring at Asuma. What Ino wants doesn't play a factor here, Kakashi said. Only what's best for Sakura. And she has plenty of others who will look after her, Naruto said. She has us, Sasuke said, voice tense and low. Kakashi ended the conversation by shutting the door in Asuma's face. Sakura hadn't been able to make the funeral and memorial arrangements. As it stood, she could barely get out of bed, she was so deep into her grief. Since it had to be done, and sooner rather than later, Kakashi had decided it would be best if he took care of these things for her. He'd left her at his apartment, where all 3 of his kids had been staying since they'd heard the news, in the care of Naruto and Sasuke. Both of whom were showing a remarkable ability to care for their teammate. Kakashi had known they all cared for each other, he'd never questioned that, but he'd had no idea the boys could be so tender and gentle. The Harunos, Kakashi had found, had been the type of people who had planned for everything. Including their deaths. When the attorney had approached him with a document specifying their wishes should something like this occur, he'd been enormously relieved. It was on his way back to his apartment after settling the last of the arrangements that Ino stormed up to him, a furious glint in her eye as she was trailed by her father and Asuma. This, he knew, wasn't going to be pretty. Give me Sakura, Ino ordered, voice imperious and furious both. She needs to be taken care of, and I'm not going to let anyone else do it. Kakashi didn't even acknowledge her, instead nodding tightly at Inoichi and Asuma in greeting. They simply looked uncomfortable, but didn't appear to be willing to do anything about Ino's behavior. Did you hear me? Ino demanded. Give me Sakura. When he still didn't acknowledge her, she gave a little scream and stomped her foot. Asuma-sensei told me you were difficult, but this is unreal, she said, then turned to Asuma and Inoichi. Kakashi watched curiously, wondering what she would do now. Daddy, Asuma-sensei, you always say how Kakashi is nothing but some burnt-out old Junin, so make him give me Sakura. He's obviously unfit to take care of her. Kakashi raised an eyebrow and looked to the two Junin, both of whom flushed lightly and tried to bluster out some excuse or another. And it was all just too fucking much for him deal with at the moment. One of his kids was hurting, and he had some little twerp who'd likely never left the safety of Konoha's walls accusing him of being unfit. Well, fuck that. Tell me, little girl, do you know who I am? He asked, squatting down so he was eye level to Ino. Ino blinked. Of course. You're Sakura's sensei. Kakashi agreed. True. And, as her Junin sensei, that means that I am now her next of kin until she refiles her paperwork in the ninja registration office. And that means that if you or your father or your sensei try to take her from me, I can have you all arrested and court-martialed. Were you aware of that? Ino just stared at him, mouth agape in clear shock. And believe me, little girl, if anyone tries to take Sakura from me right now, there will be grave consequences indeed. Because what Sakura needs right now are the people who love her, and would do anything for her, and want what is best for her more than anything else. She doesn't need a selfish little girl trying to play at being a grown-up, who wants to be seen taking care of her more than she wants to actually care for her. And Sakura doesn't need to be used as an excuse, and for you to attempt to use her grief as a ploy to get Sasuke's attention disgusts me. Ino stammered. Now wait a second, Hitaki, Inoichi tried to interrupt. Kakashi ignored him and continued to speak right over him. But I'm not just Sakura's sensei, he said. Do you know what else I am? Why you're a Junin. Ino offered. And, even though Kakashi's voice had never raised and he hadn't used any chakra or killing intent at all, she was clearly both frightened and entranced by him, caught between taking a step forward or a step back. Kakashi agreed. And I'm something of a legend in the shinobi world, did you know that? I've been inside each and every hidden village in the elemental continent and gotten back out again, and I've been listed in every single bingo book in existence for longer than you've been alive. More than half of those books give the order to immediately retreat upon sighting me, you know, as I've slaughtered entire platoons of enemy nin without any backup. I've spent years in Anbu, and have accepted more S-ranked missions than any two Konoha ninja before me combined ever have, and you should know that I have a perfect mission record. That's enough, Kakashi, Asuma said, half facing away. No, I wasn't finished, Kakashi said mildly. I have seniority over both your father and your sensei, both in rank and in years of service to Konoha, little girl, yet both of them are older than I am. I've killed more, bled more, and lost more than either of them. I'm better than them, both individually and combined. And I should tell you, little girl, that if someone tried to take Sakura from me just now, I wouldn't bother being nice enough to let a court-martial go through. No, I'd use every ounce of the skills I've earned to make whoever took her regret it. There was silence at that, as Ino shook, more scared than she'd ever been in her life. Now tell me, little girl, Kakashi said. How are you and your daddy and your sensei going to make me give Sakura to you? Asuma and Inoichi both rapidly recalculated what they knew about Hitaki Kakashi even as Ino took one step back, then two. I thought so, Kakashi said, straightening back up and looking to Inoichi and Asuma. I find your indulgence of this girl disgraceful. Just think what might have happened had she acted out against some other Junin who wasn't nearly as nice and easygoing as I am. I hope you take the training of this girl more seriously in the future. Then he disappeared in a swirl of leaves. The memorial service for Sakura's parents was held 2 days later. It was a simple affair, but a fitting homage to the elder Harunos, carried out exactly to their wishes. Sakura still hadn't said a single word. She stood at the service silently, looking as though she were standing by sheer force of will alone. Naruto and Sasuke stood at her side the entire time, hovering like protective bookends with at least one of them holding her at all times. Kakashi understood their concern, and their need to help the only way they knew how. After all, he kept his own post, standing sentry right behind the three of them. When the service was over, Kakashi looked to the crowd of people gathering around to give Sakura their condolences. It wasn't a small crowd, and for all of the times he'd been standing in Sakura's shoes, and it was more often than he ever cared to remember, Kakashi had always thought this was one of the worst parts of the whole thing. He settled a hand on her shoulder to offer what comfort he could, though he knew it wasn't much. A number of civilians who had obviously dealt with the Harunos through their shop all came over in ones and twos, giving soft, gentle words he knew were supposed to offer comfort to Sakura. Kakashi wondered if she found any of them useful. They'd never done anything for him in all the times he'd heard them. Then came Sakura's friends, mostly rookie genin or those who had failed out of the program. Ino, he saw, looked up to him in terror before giving Sakura a tight hug and scurrying away. Kakashi would have felt a bit guilty over that had he not seen her cutting her eyes to Sasuke and angling her torso just so to have given Sasuke her best possible angle. Unfortunately for Ino, Sasuke had not been looking. Kakashi had been surprised when Tsunade and Shizune had shown up, and wondered whether the legendary medic Nin had been serious when she'd mentioned taking Sakura on as an apprentice. Her presence at the memorial certainly seemed to indicate that she was. And with Jiraiya trailing behind her, Kakashi knew the old hermit would be putting up a fight to take Naruto, because he couldn't think of any reason other than Naruto that Jiraiya would come to the service. Haruno-san, please accept my sincerest condolences. Kakashi recognized the thin, reedy man with glasses and thinning hair who bowed shallowly to Sakura. I served as your parents' attorney, and I will need to speak with you at some point regarding their will. Sakura, who had remained dry-eyed up to that point, suddenly sniffled. At some point, Kakashi said, cutting the man off from saying more. But not today. The lawyer looked like he was going to protest. Then he caught sight of the look he was getting from Kakashi. And, Kakashi realized, from Naruto and Sasuke, too. The lawyer nodded quickly. Not today, of course, Junin-sama, he said. I just wanted to introduce myself to you and let you know that I am available at your convenience. Again, Haruno-san, I'm very sorry for your loss. He then quickly excused himself. Then everyone was gone except for a young man and an older couple Kakashi assumed to be his parents. As they approached, a sixth sense told him this was going to be trouble. Ah, Sakura-chan, the young man said, taking Sakura's hand in his. I'm so sorry, darling. How terrible for this to happen. How sad. Sakura blinked and tilted her head to the side, as though she were seeing what was in front of her for the first time. I know you're grieving, darling. But I want you to know, my parents and I have discussed it and we've decided that our betrothal will still go forward. So you'll have nothing to worry about. We'll be sure to have the wedding quickly, to help you get over your grief. Who are you? Sasuke demanded, even as Naruto pulled Sakura back and away from him. Me, the young man asked, putting a hand on his chest. Why, I'm Horitsu Barumo. Sakura-chan's betrothed, of course. Who are you? Sakura's team, Sasuke said curtly. And as her Junin-sensei, Kakashi cut in. I am now her guardian and next of kin. So I'll ask you to please address all legal matters, including any betrothal negotiations, exclusively to Clan Hitaki, Horitsu-san. Kakashi saw the surprise and dismay writ clear on all of the Horitsu's faces. They wanted Sakura. Likely for her family's business, though Kakashi wasn't enough of a tradesman to understand just how valuable it might be. He just knew they weren't pleased to find Sakura anything but alone and vulnerable. He sometimes hated when his sixth sense was right. Sakura had never been more grateful for her team than she was throughout the funeral and everything that came after. She'd barely been able to feed herself, much less arrange for a memorial service or deal with her parents' will. But she hadn't had to. Her team had quietly taken care of everything for her, and she hadn't been allowed more than an arm's reach away from one of them since she'd been given the news. Sakura was relatively certain that it was only their constant presence that had kept her from falling screaming into a deep abyss and never crawling out again. And now, all that was left were the details. Basically, they left everything to you, Kakashi told her as they ate dinner in his apartment. That he'd let them all stay with him for so long was just one of the things she was indebted to him for. The day he'd just spent with her parents' attorney, without making her go with him, was another. There are only two things you have to make decisions on now, the shop and your betrothal. My what? Sakura asked. She noticed Sasuke and Naruto giving Kakashi keen looks. And Kakashi himself looked vaguely uncomfortable. Horitsu Barumo has put a claim in on your parents' estate, saying that he and your parents had reached an agreement that you were to be betrothed, he explained. But I don't want to be married, Sakura said, eyes going wide as the feelings of panic encroached. Then I'll take care of it, Kakashi said, voice dark. Sakura didn't want to know how he was going to take care of it, and quite honestly didn't care. All she knew was that she'd kill herself before she married Barumo. Good, Sasuke said, nodding to Kakashi. And what about the shop? The shop, Sakura trailed off. I don't want to be a shopkeeper. I'm a kunoichi. But I don't know what to do. I can't get rid of it, they love that shop so much. She began to weep again. Maybe it would be better for me to marry Barumo after all. Then he could take care of the shop, and, you're not marrying anyone, Kakashi said firmly. And don't worry about the shop, Sakura-chan, Naruto said, I'll take care of it. But you're a shinobi, not a shopkeeper, she said. Naruto grinned. But you forget, Sakura-chan, he said. I wasn't always a shinobi. And I know people who aren't shinobi. Just trust me. She nodded, too grateful she didn't have to make any decisions at all to question things too heavily. It hadn't been difficult for Kakashi to find where the Horitsu family lived. They were, after all, just civilians while he was an elite Junin of Konoha. And he thought dealing with the betrothal issue promptly would be for the best. So it was that first thing the morning after discussing it with Sakura that Kakashi was knocking on their front door. A servant answered, bowing to him. Good morning, Shinobi-sama, the girl said. How might this one be of service? And he was promptly shown in and asked to wait for the Horitsus in their handsomely furnished receiving room. When they made him wait an entire half hour, he knew that they didn't care what he had to say, that they were the type who thought they'd get their way no matter what. He'd dealt with their kind before and knew this wouldn't go away quickly or easily. Kakashi felt a headache coming on. Hitaki-san, Barumo greeted as he wandered in, his parents in tow. How nice that you were able to stop by to see us. I am here in my role as Haruno Sakura's guardian, Kakashi said formally, addressing himself to the patriarch of the family as was proper in these circumstances. Haruno-san is not seeking a husband at this time, and while honored by your offer, is unable to accept. Three jaws went slack at his pronouncement. I know Sakura is young, the patriarch said. But her father and I had a number of serious discussions about the future. We had agreed on the dowry and the bride price, and all that was left was to sign the documents. Sakura and Barumo were to be betrothed until she was old enough to properly marry. And by that, Kakashi knew he meant old enough to safely bear an heir. He found himself wanting to make sure that neither Horitsu man was ever able to create an heir again. I'm willing to abide by that agreement still if she would like time, the elder Horitsu continued, unaware of the violent bent of Kakashi's thoughts, but it's best for her not to be worried about her future. She's just a little girl, after all. She is a kunoichi, Kakashi disagreed. And she is my ward. We have discussed her future, and it has been decided that Haruno-san is not seeking a husband at this time. There will be no betrothal, Horitsu-san. I had a deal with Haruno-san. You can't do this. I can, Kakashi corrected. Haruno-san was very thorough, and sent his attorney a copy of the notice breaking off their negotiations with you, Horitsu-san. As Sakura is not seeking a husband, I see no need to begin the negotiations anew. Barumo turned red. Listen here, you thug, Barumo said, storming over to him. If you know what's good for you, you'll hand over the little twit. Kakashi just raised an eyebrow, wondering if he was supposed to be intimidated. Maybe if the boy didn't look as soft as a newborn, he might have been mildly concerned. Then again, no. Do you know who you're dealing with? Barumo demanded, throwing his hands out and shoving Kakashi back. Well, tried to, anyway. Kakashi just tilted his head to the side. I'm curious, Horitsu-san, Kakashi replied. Do you know who you're dealing with? Barumo lifted his hands to shove him again, but Kakashi raised his own hand in warning. I allowed your first assault, and am willing to let it slide, given what I am sure is your extreme disappointment in finding your tentative betrothal is no more. Kakashi's tone of voice made it clear just what he thought of both the assault and Barumo's disappointment. But think carefully before you take that next step, Horitsu-san. I will not be so forgiving of another attack on my person. Barumo's face turned even darker red, and Kakashi was sure it was only his father's order to sit down along with his mother physically taking his hand that prevented Barumo from trying to kill him. Kakashi thought it rather a shame Barumo hadn't tried. Because he was sure these people were snakes in the grass, and that they would come back time and again until they either got what they wanted or were defanged. And an assault on a Konoha shinobi would go a long way towards that defanging. It had been close to a week since the funeral. Kakashi hadn't been at all surprised that Sakura hadn't made any noises about returning home, but that neither Sasuke nor Naruto had was certainly curious. Instead, they were all three still camped out in his tiny, one-bedroom apartment. And, while he did admit that it was a bit of a relief to have all three of his kids together in one place where he could keep an eye on them, he also had to be honest enough, at least to himself, to admit that it was disconcerting to have his space invaded and completely taken over by his kids. Kakashi had been living alone since age 6 and was well and truly set in his ways, after all. But, watching them as they continued the conditioning regime he'd set up for them, listening to their friendly banter, Kakashi found he couldn't bring himself to even think about suggesting they leave. They all seemed so much better together, when they had each other to lean on and support. And, really, they were all still so fragile. Sakura was still desperately grieving for her parents, and lived in something of a zombie-like state whenever the boys weren't distracting her. Sasuke had been an obsessive disaster waiting to happen since Itachi had killed his clan, and while his downward spiral into insanity had stopped, Kakashi was under no illusions that he wouldn't still be raising major red flags on his next psych eval. And Naruto somehow thought he was a prostitute's child, had far too many contacts with the Yakuza, and had an inferiority complex so large and so deeply ingrained that he was certain he'd never even make Chunin and, somehow, had been able to hide all of it well enough that Kakashi hadn't even noticed until Naruto had practically hit him over the head with it. And yet, somehow, they all fit together. Kakashi motioned with his hand for them to start sparring as they finished the last of the exercises he'd set them on. Then he sighed and laid on his back, stretching his legs out and closing his eyes as he tried to think of ways to make his kids whole again as he listened to the sounds of their sparring and the light banter of their exchanges. They really were better when they were together. Sakura would smile sometimes. And Sasuke would allow himself to relax the tiniest bit. And Naruto seemed calmer, and somehow more whole. And with the three of them all living together, the effects were only amplified. So no, he couldn't ask them to leave. Which left him with the dilemma of 4 people all living in his tiny one-bedroom apartment. Sleeping on the job, Kakashi? Kurenai asked, clear disapproval in her tone. Really, they deserve the benefit of your full attention, such as it is. If you accept a genin team, they need to be your priority. Kakashi only grunted, annoyed that she was there at all, much less that she, a newly minted Junin, thought she could lecture him. I know you're supposed to be legendary, she lectured, annoying him even further. Because while he didn't care what others thought, the constant doubting of his abilities he'd run into lately was frustrating. He supposed he'd have to do something about Danzo's rumors after all. But you can't just ignore them and expect them to somehow learn. They're your responsibility now, and you have to start acting like it. Kurenai, Kakashi said without opening his eyes or sitting up. Go away. And get back to work, kids. They had been far too quiet and had gotten much too close for Kakashi to believe they were still sparring seriously instead of listening in on his conversation. Nay, Kaka-sensei, Sakura said, playing up the little girl role. Can't we take a break? And she threw herself down next to him, laying her head on his stomach even as Sasuke sat against him and used his bent legs as a backrest. He didn't miss that they'd placed themselves between him and Kurenai. Or that Naruto stood just behind them, loose and ready just in case he was needed. It was cute, he decided, that they so clearly wanted to protect him. They really were good kids. Kakashi, I need to speak with you, Kurenai said, interrupting his thoughts. Alone. He refrained from sighing. Lake, he told the kids. They all groaned. But Kaka-sensei, Sakura pouted. Do we have to? Naruto asked. Go, Kakashi told them. TCH, Sasuke sniffed in annoyance. How many? I'll tell you when you can stop. They all groaned some more, then got up and headed off to the lake at a jog. He'd rescue them from their laps in a while. No more than an hour. Or 2. He sat up and finally opened his eye, glancing at Kurenai only to find her looking very displeased. Well, he prompted her. They're turning 13 this year, she said. Which means you'll have to start teaching them about bodywork missions. To call it a bodywork mission was the polite way of discussing a mission where sex was involved. He wasn't surprised Kurenai used the polite terminology. Hot as she was also ridiculously prim and proper. And, he asked. And, I wanted to make sure Sakura was given all the tools she needs. Kurenai crossed her arms in front of her chest as she leaned against a tree. I don't want to see a kunoichi get herself into trouble because she was sent out without the proper training. Kakashi raised an eyebrow at her. Look, she said, frustrated. I just wanted to tell you that I'll train her for this, and sometime next month, I'll be taking her for a week or two for it. Have you ever been on a lipstick mission? Kakashi asked, using the term most kunoichi put to sexually related missions. Kurenai flushed and began to protest his asking. No, I didn't think so. For all that he does his best to be fair and even, the Hokage does know that Asuma has had his eye on you for years now. Her face turned a deep red at that. That has nothing to do with, it has everything to do with this, as I would never leave my team to be trained by an inexperienced instructor. I can take care of training my own team, and will do so when and how I see fit, Kakashi said, cutting her off. You'll not take Sakura next week. And you will not make plans to take any of my genin without my permission again. She looked like she was going to protest. Dismissed, Kurenai, he said pointedly. She turned on her heel and left. Kakashi still wasn't sure how, when it was his apartment, somehow the kids had taken over his bed and he'd been relegated to the couch. But as he watched over them, he couldn't help but smile just a bit at how, curled up together as they were, they looked like nothing so much as a pile of puppies exhausted from a hard day of playing. Of course, in their case, playing meant intense training. But Kakashi wasn't sure how else to make sure they would all be able to sleep. All of his kids were haunted by enough to keep anyone up at night, so he continued to train them into exhaustion day after day, in hopes of helping them take their minds off of it. It had worked for him. Well, mostly, anyway. Sometimes. Occasionally. So alright, Kakashi decided, I'll have to come up with something better for them. Naruto shifted in his sleep, unable to keep still even while unconscious, and Sasuke's elbow shoved into Naruto's ribs in a way Kakashi thought looked very uncomfortable even as Sakura clung to the blonde a little tighter. Kakashi shook his head and headed to the couch with the threadbare blanket and old, dilapidated pillow. He pursed his lips as he considered the situation. Napping on the old couch every once in a while was fine, but it wasn't a substitute for his bed. The lumps were starting to make his back ache, and he was too tall, leaving his feet to stick off the end. Which meant the blanket always slipped, and he woke up every morning with freezing feet. Kakashi hated having cold feet. He sighed as he settled in for another uncomfortable night. They couldn't all continue living in his tiny apartment. Hell, the place was barely livable for one old bachelor. And he couldn't send the kids off to live by themselves again. He knew firsthand how much that messed with your mind to be on your own at such a young age. They couldn't stay. And they couldn't go. Which, he realized, really left them only one option. He sighed again, this time in distress. The things he did for his kids. Ohio Mina-san, Kakashi said, waking them with a cheeriness he was certain sounded as forced as it felt. Today we have a most dangerous mission assigned to us. Indeed, we shall be risking life, limb, and our very sanity by tackling such a thing. Oh, no, Sakura put her hands over her face as Naruto groaned and Sasuke sighed heavily. D-rank mission, restore an abandoned clan house. Kakashi said, hardened by their obvious suffering. They all groaned in dismay, then rolled out of the bed and began getting ready. He tossed them each a granola bar and a banana and the kids began trudging along after him, still rubbing the sleep out of their eyes as he led them away from the more populated section of Konoha into one of the older neighborhoods. The streets there were narrow, and the houses lining them, all larger family homes built in the old, traditional style, were all set back far enough from the road that privacy was guaranteed. This district had no apartment buildings, no shops, no restaurants, just old clan-style homes. It seemed far too soon, but there they were, turning down a lane that he hadn't walked on in almost 20 years. He cursed himself silently when he saw his kids had picked up on his sudden tensing, causing them to come alert and move slightly apart from each other so as not to create too large a target and give themselves room to maneuver. In other circumstances, Kakashi would be pleased they did such a thing so automatically. Now, he was just annoyed. Ma, just bad memories, he said, signing to them to stand down. He could practically feel their stares burning into the back of his head. Then they were at the stone pathway that led from the street to his old family house. He had a flashback of himself as a little kid, running down the path to greet his father as he came home from a mission, then jumping into his arms and riding on his shoulders back to the house where his mother was waiting. He shook his head to clear it, and began down the path at a brisk pace. "Nay, sensei," Sakura asked hesitantly, tugging on his sleeve a bit, "are you sure, that is everything all right?" Fine, he said, patting her head dismissively even as he silently berated himself for not making a solo trip first to clear out any old ghosts he might have. He quickly strode up to the door and sliced his thumb, smearing it over the seal the fourth had placed on the house for him. "Wait," Naruto said, eyeing the seal in a way Kakashi decided had far too much interest. So he quickly performed the simple dispelling seal the fourth had taught him to remove the preservation seal. Then he looked up to see Naruto watching him, probably knowing quite a bit more than Kakashi would prefer just from his short glimpse at the seals. But he didn't ask questions, for which Kakashi was grateful. "Come on," he said, waving to them to follow him into the house. "So, what exactly are we here for again?" Sasuke asked, looking around. "Or cleaning it out," Kakashi said. "And the guy who used to live here was a paranoid little bastard, so you can think of dealing with all of the traps as a sort of training." He grinned as they groaned again. Then he opened the door and led them inside. As they looked around, even Kakashi was surprised by the simultaneous state of disarray and tidiness tucked away inside the house. Pieces of furniture were still shoved out of the way, exactly where he'd pushed them so he could train inside the house when his sensei had demanded he go home, and at least half of it was destroyed as a result of that training. There were various dishes that were still piled in the sink, remnants of food still caked onto them. And he had to wonder what his bedroom was like. But there wasn't more than a fine layer of dust coating anything, probably the same dust that had been there when Minato-sensei had sealed the house. "How long has this place been abandoned?" Naruto asked, and Kakashi forced himself out of his fog. "Oh, about 20 years, Kakashi answered. He noticed the appraising look Naruto was giving the place and wondered what else he had managed to pick up. The boy really was much more observant than most people ever gave him credit for, but just now, Kakashi wished he'd turn it off. "Bull," Sasuke said, much to all of their surprise. "I've seen houses that have been abandoned for years, and this doesn't look like any I've ever seen." "The seal Kaka-sensei broke was for more than security," Naruto said. "I couldn't get much more of a read on it than that it had an element of preservation in it, but I did manage to catch that before Kaka-sensei broke it." Kakashi ignored Naruto's accusing glare. "Can you put one on another clan house?" Sasuke asked Kakashi, who belatedly realized what abandoned houses he'd visited and why, exactly, they'd been abandoned. "I don't know enough about the seal to recreate it," Kakashi admitted. He was a bit disconcerted when Sasuke immediately shrugged and turned to Naruto. "I didn't see much of it," Naruto hedged, closing his eyes to try to dredge up an image of it from the brief glimpse he'd gotten. "I'll do what I can." "Not right now, you won't," Kakashi said, glancing to Sakura, who still hadn't said a word. "People will be moving in shortly, so we need to get it back into shape as best we can as quickly as we can. So get moving." He supposed that he hadn't been in much shape to do much housekeeping after his mother had died, but he hadn't realized he'd been this bad. Some areas were as pristine as they'd ever been while his mother was alive. Other areas looked as though they'd been invaded by filth. He could see why the fourth had made him move. Looking back, he'd obviously been self-destructing. And honestly, he couldn't quite pinpoint when he'd stopped. He found himself alone in a room with Naruto, who was looking at him with eyes that were far too old. "This was your home, wasn't it?" Naruto said quietly. Kakashi scratched the back of his head sheepishly. "What gave it away?" he asked. Naruto shrugged. "So you're moving back in?" he asked instead. "Ah, well, that is, I'd hoped to tell the three of you all at once," Kakashi said. Naruto nodded, as though that made sense to him. "I'm used to being on my own," Naruto said. "I'm going to try to, for that matter, Sasuke is, too, but he never really adapted, since he had family for the first half of his life." And he depends on you more than I think you realize, Naruto continued without allowing Kakashi to finish. And as for Sakura, I think you know how ill-suited she is to being on her own. Kakashi nodded. These were some of the exact reasons he'd made the decision he had. So I want you to promise me you won't abandon them when the baby comes. Kakashi blinked. The baby? He asked. Naruto cocked his head to the side. Isn't that why you're doing this? Naruto asked. I heard a rumor about a girl I'd heard you were seeing. That she'd, gotten in trouble. Isn't that why you're moving back into your old home? To move her in here to raise your kid. My kid, Kakashi said, stunned and more than a little confused and dazed. Look, I think you have the wrong idea here, Naruto. I haven't seen that girl, hell, any girl, since I got you guys as a team. Kakashi considered that and decided that this was a situation he would have to rectify. He'd been without for longer in the past, but it had usually involved long-term missions. If she's in trouble, the kid isn't mine. It was Naruto's turn to blink in surprise. Oh, he said. So, whatever you were thinking was going to happen with this house. That isn't it, Kakashi said. And even if it was, do you really think I'd abandon the three of you? Naruto only cocked his head to the side, and Kakashi realized that the confusion from Wave hadn't done his sense of belonging any good. You're mine, Naruto, Kakashi said with a sigh, tugging Naruto closer and petting the back of his neck. For better or for worse, you're mine. Now go help Sasuke with the next room. Naruto eyed him for another few moments, then tucked his face into Kakashi's side and clutched one hand onto his vest in a fleeting imitation of a hug, then nodded and disappeared. Kakashi rubbed his forehead, wondering if he truly understood what it was he was getting into and decided he likely didn't. But, he thought as he looked around the remnants of his father's old room, he could probably safely say he wasn't self-destructing anymore. Probably. When they'd finished hauling out all of the furniture that was broken beyond repair and cleaning up all of the various little messes Kakashi had left before Minato-sensei had dragged him out of the house all but kicking and screaming, the kids turned to him for direction. Let's sit, he said, suddenly nervous. He sat on the spot, right on the ground, not even bothering to find a chair that hadn't been scrapped. The kids shrugged and did the same. This place, Kakashi trailed off, running a hand through his hair and uncertain how to say what he wanted to say. Words had never been his strong point. Give him a kunai and he could do just about anything asked of him in seconds. But feelings and emotions and, may the will of fire help him, explaining them, were big giant gaping black pits he'd always glossed over and avoided when at all possible. And Kakashi often made a point of making it possible. This used to be my house, he spit out. Then he shook his head. Is my house. It's my clan home. He let out a breath, frustrated at himself. Then he looked to his kids, none of whom looked particularly surprised. You knew. They all nodded and he cocked his head, silently asking for an explanation. The seal, Naruto said with a shrug, which Kakashi had already known. I cleaned up a few of your special shirts with the masks in them, Sakura explained. I can't believe you wore them even when you were that little. It was listed on a map of all the clan compounds in my father's den. Sasuke refused to look at him, but Kakashi understood. Both the shame of going through your dead father's things and the embarrassment of being caught out looking for information on your sensei. He'd done both, too, once upon a time. Right, he said. Well, then. Here's the thing. I can't deal with cold feet anymore. They all looked at him like he'd gone a little bit crazy. He wasn't sure they weren't right. He shook his head, clearing it so he could put words together in a way that other people might actually be able to make sense of. What I mean is, my apartment is too small. We should move here, instead. There was dead silence at that pronouncement. Look, it's big enough, and you can each have your own bedroom, and I'm not saying you should give up your other places, but this way. He was cut off when Sakura dove at him, settling against his chest and gripping him tightly enough he absently realized the conditioning he'd set her was working. Thank you, sensei, she said, voice a bit muffled by his vest. He looked up to the boys to see what they thought, to find them both looking poleaxed, but not necessarily opposed. He decided to move to make it final before they thought to object. Let's pick out your rooms, he said, standing and hoisting Sakura onto his back. The boys didn't move, still trying to make sense of what was going on. He understood. The idea of living with other people after being on your own for so long was one that would take some getting used to. He was still rather iffy on the idea himself. Not that he'd tell them that, of course. Instead he bent and scooped both boys up, one under each arm, and dragged all three of his kids through the house to find their rooms. Of course, they immediately began squirming to get away, but Kakashi just shifted his grip to keep hold and ignored their increasingly loud and dangerous, if he hadn't been a Junin, protests of the treatment. Then Sakura began giggling. And he relaxed. Because even if this wasn't exactly the conventional thing to do, for them it was just right. Thanks for listening. I hope you guys liked it. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a like for more what ifs and support the author. See you guys in the next video.